Ladies and gentlemen, please make very welcome Ita Buttrose.
Thank you very much, John. I'm just going to speak down there. And Christine, it's very good to see you again. And I'm delighted to have been asked to launch your book, Travels with My Hat. I kept wanting to write Travels with My Aunt, and I had to stop that. Travels with My Hat, A Lifetime on the Road. It is a beautiful book with that distinct Osborne style that anyone familiar with her work enjoys. Now, I can't remember when Christine first entered my life. I know it was during the early years of when I edited Clio, the magazine that I created for Sir Frank and Kerry Packer more than 40 years ago. And Clio was the kind of magazine that broke new ground. It encouraged women to set their sights high. And many creative people got their big professional break writing for Clio, taking photographs for us, providing us with cartoons and illustrations. It was really a wonderful time to be editing a magazine like Clio. The 70s was a terrific period in Australia, a wonderful period of change. And as many of you would remember, it was a time that Gough Whitlam became the Prime Minister of Australia. And he did, I think the greatest thing Gough ever did for us as a country was he stirred in us a sense of patriotism that I think we all had, but we didn't know it. And for the first time he said to us, you know, you can make your name here in Australia. You don't have to go overseas to make your name. You can actually make it here. And Clio was very much of that kind of thinking, which is why I think we attracted so many talented people like Christine, for instance. So our encouragement of women also included the people who worked for us. And Christine is that rare being among travel writers. She doesn't bore the reader witless. We're using words like stunning, brilliant, breathtaking, kaleidoscope. But rather through her observations and her attention to detail, she takes the reader on a journey. And it's a rare gift to find a travel writer who can do this. And I couldn't believe my good fortune when Christine joined Clio as our travel editor. She was, and I'm sure she still is, a proudly independent woman, an adventurer, and as some of us thought back in the 70s, a woman to be admired, as she was an intrepid traveller, always travelling on her own to many way out of the way places where she often found herself in difficult situations. And this was long before package tours became commonplace. And even now, I think if you were to ask her if she'd like to travel with a friend on a trip, she'd say, as she often did when she wrote for me, I travel alone. So perhaps in a way she was the Greta Garbo of travel writers, I'm not sure. But she'd return from a trip, say from the Middle East, and she'd call in, unannounced, to tell me about it. I'd look up and there she was at my office door, and I remember saying to her once, why don't you make an appointment like most people do? But she didn't even bother. She just come straight in, sit down, and start telling me about where she'd been and what she'd seen. And I would listen, absolutely riveted. And then she'd settle into negotiations about what I'd pay for her story and her photographs. She always had brilliant photographs, and she didn't part with them cheaply. Now, there's only once I recollect that she didn't actually get the photographs we thought we might get. And it was when she was in Saudi covering the royal tour of the Queen and Prince Philip for the Australian Women's Weekly after I became editor. And for those of you who don't remember, the Weekly once was a weekly. That's why it's called the Weekly. Well, it's still called the Weekly, and now it's a monthly, and I have no idea why that happens. But anyway, it was once a weekly. And anyway, Christine managed to trip over during a photo call at the state banquet in Riyadh, and she failed to get, how do you say that? I've forgotten. In Saudi, and she failed to get any photographs. And this was 1979. I'd sent her to cover the 3-week tour of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states by the British royals. It was the first of its kind by a reigning British monarch. And consequently, it provoked intense interest around the world, with much curiosity about how a female head of state would be treated by the all-male leaders of Arab countries, and of course, what the Queen would wear. The Queen, therefore, often wore long gowns during the daytime so as not to offend any cultural sensitivities. And she also did the same for evening functions. And so did Christine, which is how she managed to trip over and miss those photographs at the state banquet, her heel caught in the hem of her gown. But in true Women's Weekly fashion, and as John indicated, Christine soon bonded with the Queen and Prince Philip. I think they feel very comfortable with Australians. With the Queen telling her on one occasion, when she got lost in a crowd, that she did look out for that blue hat. And Prince Philip once saw, on the same trip, saw a raft pack. And they didn't really like this outsider. And so they weren't very welcoming. And the prince caught one of them treading on her foot and sort of grinding it to the ground. And after that, he sort of kept a special eye on her. Now, the prince, I have to say, I once had afternoon tea with him on the Royal Yacht Britannia when he was here. He does have a twinkle in his eye, and he does appreciate a fine-looking woman as well. Anyway, as usual, Christine, being the consummate professional that she is, did a first-class job of reporting and observing, and she also made sure that her photographs were dispatched in time for the weekly to beat our then rival Woman's Day. And in those days, of course, we all used films for photography. There was no digital photography. And the films had to be dispatched to us by plane from the Middle East to London, where they then got the plane to Sydney, where we then picked them up at customs in Sydney and developed them to see what we had. And of course the weekly was on sale first, and I was very pleased. And I told Christine so by cable. And our readers loved her report, which we titled, "Carry on down the Gulf, ma'am, the sheiks love you." And then again, as John referred, there was the time I commissioned an article from Christine on a child that the magazine, the Cleo, had adopted through the foster parents plan in Ethiopia. And these kind of plans weren't very well known and very well supported back then, as they are now. People were initially suspicious that perhaps the foster children weren't receiving the funding that the scheme promised them. So our intrepid Christine was soon on a converted military plane with a variety of passengers, some human, some not. 2 untethered goats travelled with her, and she writes about them in her book, how they kept slipping and sliding in the plane. You know, the mind boggles at this trip. Anyway, she eventually arrived safely at the small Ethiopian village where our foster child Sisse lived, and she reported back to us that with funding from Cleo, he would be able to attend primary school, unlike many of the village people, most of whom were illiterate. And of course, she took some great photographs of Sissy, stories like the ones that Christine wrote rarely appeared in women's magazines in the 70s. You know, this was not something women's magazines normally covered. So again, with Christine's help, we were breaking new ground, and she's always done that. You know, that's the essence of this woman in the way she's always treated travel. Writing these notes have actually taken me back to one of the happiest times of my life as a magazine editor. It was always a joy to see Christine. She was always suntanned, she was lean, she had enthusiasm written all over, and her zest for living was infectious. And I always remember you had the whitest of eyes, the colour of the eyes, right, but the white was always white. So I think she must have led a very healthy life with all her travelling. It was always notable. And I always felt like packing a bag and running away with her on some amazing travel adventure, but I always knew it was not to be, because after all, Christine is a solo traveller. Be that as it may, when Christine sets off on one of her adventures, when she writes and through her photographs, she does invite other people to travel with her. And when you get to the end of Travels with My Hat, A Lifetime on the Road, I'm sure you will have enjoyed sharing Christine's journey. And it gives me great pleasure to now officially launch Christine's wonderful book, and I hope it does exceedingly well, because it deserves to. Thank you.